Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Beware Euphoria, The Moral Roots and Racial Myths of America's War on Drugs, by George Fisher. Narrated by Jonathan Yen. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Prologue. Why are we married to alcohol? More to the point, why have we stayed faithful? Since time out of mind, alcohol has reigned almost everywhere as our lone, legal intoxicant. Countless rivals have beckoned our affections, whispering promises of elegiac dreams or fantastic visions or the bliss of suspended awareness. Yet, forswearing all others, we have held true to alcohol. This book aims to explain why. Today, with so much in flux, with legalized cannabis advancing across the land, it's time to ask why we've remained wedded to alcohol so long. Though I hope to explain this long devotion and our stubborn rejection of other recreational drugs, I won't defend our war on drugs. Instead, I'll ask how it came to pass. Like many others, I question the wisdom of our national drug law regime. Our struggle to suppress recreational drugs has spawned a thriving street trade marked by extortionate prices, extravagant profits, violent turf wars, and abusive police tactics. Accused drug offenders, too often young men of color, bloat our prisons. By waging a war with such faint prospects for victory, we perhaps have blinded ourselves to better ways to attack the evils of drugs. But the policies of the present are not the focus of this book. Instead, I look backward for the roots of a regime that has embraced alcohol, if only warily, while spurning its recreational rivals. Alcohol monogamy. Why, then, have we been married to alcohol? The answer is scarcely seen in scholarly assaults on the drug war, and hardly heard in the rhetoric of policymakers who prop up our laws against change. Ask those academics who deride our drug bans how such wayward policies took hold. Many will say racism. So often the virus of injustice spread its worm here. We banned opium, they say, because Chinese miners and railroad workers brought it here. Cocaine, because African Americans made it their drug of choice. And marijuana because migrant Mexicans cast its seed north of the border. Or they say our drug laws arose because early factory owners feared drug-hazed workers would drag down output. Rooted in racism and class conflict, they charge, drug bans claim no legitimacy as law. Ask instead those office holders who defy change how our drug laws came to pass. Most reply in utilitarian tones, speaking a calculus of harms and risks. The dangers of addiction, they say, and of overdose and death, proved weightier than the rapture of escape. Alcohol, they admit, is a pestilence too, but it is the devil we know. Alcohol has survived, despite its evils, because we have learned how to keep them in check. Attractive or plausible as these claims may be, they all miss the mark. Why have we banned recreational intoxicants? The answer is almost too plain to see. We have banned recreational intoxicants because they intoxicate. They disable our reason and self-command, if only for a while, with no better excuse than recreation. We have banned recreational intoxicants, not because they harm us or give pleasure to groups we despise, but because of our cultural euphoria taboo, an old and deep and essentially moral aversion to pleasures that numb the mind. But doesn't alcohol, too, befuddle the brain? Surely it can, but only when taken in excess. Used in moderation, alcohol leaves reason intact, and acuity almost undimmed. It delivers not the mindless rapture of escape, but the pleasure of minds meeting, engaged with each other, and now the more manageable cares of this world. Yet if alcohol came only as a 10-shot swallow, so one couldn't drink but get drunk, we would ban it, too. Alcohol may be the devil we know, but if it served only to intoxicate, slurring conversation without brightening it, alcohol, too, would face the prohibitionists' axe. Of course, at times we have banned drink. Maine and a trail of copycat states outlawed alcohol in the mid-19th century, and the 18th Amendment turned America dry decades later. Americans' exuberant resistance to national prohibition has made that era of moonshine and speakeasies irresistible material for modern historians and storytellers. But the prominence of these episodes in our historical memory obscures the reality of our relationship with alcohol. Save for a few years here, or a dozen years there, alcohol has survived for millennia as a routine, widely condoned, if often reviled, fixture of Western culture. More precisely, alcohol has thrived as our lone recreational drug. Alcohol has other uses, as a sacramental wine, say, or a substrate for some medicines. Other drugs, too, have non-recreational uses that don't offend the law. Hence, opium and cocaine and their kin deaden physical pain, and peyote enables the spiritual rituals of native peoples. Prozac, Xanax, and their ilk aim to restore normal moods and coping mechanisms. Such non-recreational drug use, however, is not the topic of this book on our cultural euphoria taboo. Instead, my focus is on drugging to pleasure and disable the mind, and on the role old moral notions have played in banning such drug use. Drugs' dangers. But aren't the real sins of banned drugs that they kill by overdose and addict? Surely if a drug kills even when used with care, it should and will be banned. So too should thalidomide and other drugs that cripple users or disfigure their offspring. Yet the case against opium, cocaine, and cannabis in the early days of our drug war rarely focused on their ravages to the body. Instead, early lawmakers banned these drugs because they blight our brains, if only briefly, blotting out reason with base pleasure. Addiction, in this light, is not a standalone cause of anti-drug lawmaking, but an aggravator of moral ills. People confess addiction to caffeine, yet no one thinks this dependency shameful, and no lawmaker deems it cause for a ban. For caffeine sharpens rather than deadens the mind, and delivers no euphoric escape from reality. Even nicotine, though fiercely addictive, is lawful throughout the land. Cigarettes' hazards to health have put them off limits to minors, and their danger to bystanders has exiled them from public spaces. Someday, maybe, their distortion of the health marketplace will trigger a broader ban. But addictiveness alone has prompted no bar. Because nicotine, like caffeine, concentrates the mind, it escapes the clamor of moral condemnation that falls on any drug daring to call itself ecstasy. Still, the addictive power of many drugs figures in our drug war's moral history. Though addictiveness alone will not prompt the ban of a non-euphoric drug, adding addictiveness to a euphoric drug's stupefying power spurs an even stricter ban. For addiction, aggravates the moral offense of capitulating to base pleasure by making that collapse enduring and complete. The addictive quality of many intoxicants magnifies the loss of self-control and makes the addicted, in the words of St. Thomas Aquinas, a slave to pleasures. Race-hued morality. Race, too, plays a role in this history of our drug war, but not the role commonly claimed. At certain times and in certain places, racial biases have warped the timing and severity of our drug bans, and over time, the racism that pulses through our culture has contorted our drug law regimes. Seen in rear view across decades of racial strife, our earliest anti-drug laws seem grown from soil soaked in racism. Drug war historians have projected onto this earlier era the dynamics of today's race-infused justice system, in which police officers' biases, and those of prosecutors, judges, jurors, and lawmakers, skew outcomes against black and brown persons. Against this modern backdrop, claims that early drug bans arose from bigotry toward Chinese newcomers, African Americans, and Mexicans seem compelling. Such accounts are not simply mistaken. They are exactly wrong. For our earliest anti-drug laws were not about the Chinese, African Americans, or Mexicans, sometimes linked with opium, cocaine, and marijuana. These were laws about whites. The lawmakers who erected America's earliest drug bans acted first and foremost to protect the morals of their own racial kin, and because the morals of most importance to white lawmakers were those of white women and their own offspring, they acted fastest and most forcefully when a drug took white women and white youth, and especially respectable women and youth, in its clutches. Police officers, too, often trained their drug enforcement zeal on white users and those who sold to whites. Nor was this focus on the morals of white users merely a feint to cover a more devious design, say to criminalize and imprison non-white sellers. We'll see that when Chinese den keepers sold opium to other Chinese, they suffered little police interference. Yet when whites opened opium dens for other whites, police hauled them in. Later, when laws against cocaine and cannabis first took form, the sellers in question were often white, and perhaps mostly so. Here, then, was racism, but not the same breed of racism fingered by many historians as the force behind early anti-drug laws. These laws arose not out of hatred of non-whites linked with certain drugs, and not with intent to oppress them. Instead, lawmakers acted to protect the morals of their own kind while disregarding the morals of others. Defining morality. Any study that looks to moral attitudes to explain historical trends first must say, whose moral code is at issue? Ultimately, this book aims to explain how the American legal regimes governing alcohol and other recreational drugs took form. That goal compels a focus on the Western, largely Christian, moral tradition, especially that of England and America, for English law helped shape much of our own. And because elected representatives crafted our anti-drug laws, the morals that matter most are those of the cultural mainstream, to which successful politicians pay fealty. So I'm not writing about my moral attitudes or yours. Not everyone shares mainstream values, or we'd have no need for drug laws, and those who don't will not recognize themselves here. They may, however, recognize their neighbors. In some places, Berkeley, say, or Boulder, or Greenwich Village, even one's neighbors may fall outside the mold. But I am writing about the broad middle of American society, not its bluest extremities. In defining moral, I prefer to set dictionaries aside. Moral has many meanings, but here I mean only one. We have deemed moral what befits decent and essentially human conduct, and we have deemed essentially human the shared pleasures of the mind, including love, learning, conversation, wit, and fellow feeling. Not all else is immoral, but those things that undermine or disable what is essentially human, that render us appetitive or base or insensitive to the world about us, risk condemnation. Hence, our cultural aversion to intoxication stems mostly from the nature of intoxication itself, its heedless suspension of self-control, its abdication of rational functioning, its indulgence in mindless pleasure. These phrases may call to mind the stupefying euphoria of opium smoking or drunkenness. They also may call to mind sex. For sex, like drug intoxication and drunkenness, suspends self-control, abdicates rationality, and indulges in mindless pleasure. Sex is our original euphoriant, our pleasure. In the Western moral tradition, lust and drunkenness have stood side by side in the dock, accused of robbing us of our godlike reason and transforming us into beasts. So the Church's regulation of sex in early Christian times set the moral template for the regulation of alcohol in Puritan times and of drugs still later. This similarity among the old moral regimes governing sex and alcohol and drugs is some evidence of the primacy of moral objections in shaping the regulation of substance abuse. For while sex and intoxicants are bad in many ways, only along the moral dimension are they bad in the same way. Tempering all three moral regimes is the moral excuse of necessity. From the days of Plato onward, a plausible claim of need has suspended the usual strictures against euphoric conduct or substance abuse. Necessity weaves in and out of this narrative, sometimes setting the terms of lawful indulgence in sex or alcohol or drugs, and sometimes supplying a tempting excuse to cross the lines of the law for those who claim to be moral but wish to indulge. The Path Ahead. This book traces a long path across time and space. I will make stops along that path, digging into debates about conduct or substances in specific eras and locales. At times the listener may wish to linger, digging deeper at one spot or exploring diverging trails. Yet only by taking broad steps between stops, sometimes traversing swaths of time and space, can we see the shared beliefs driving sexual strictures, drunkenness taboos, and drug bans. Our journey begins in San Francisco in the mid to late 19th century, where a recent ban on opium dens stood alongside a thriving saloon culture. Here we face the paradox of monogamy. Why have we banned only one of these vices, not obviously the worse of the two? To resolve that paradox, we step back in time and seek in Chapter 1 the seeds of this moral regime in early Christian strictures against sex. The old Church Fathers, and most prominently St. Augustine, condemned recreational, non-procreative sex, which indulges our beastly appetites and suspends our godlike reason. But however troubling sex might be as a moral matter, the Church Fathers saw our survival required it. Here we have the mediating force of necessity. The demands of marriage and procreation excused indulgence in the mindless, uncontrolled pleasure of sex, but only as necessary. Moralists of medieval and early modern times condemned drunkenness in terms strikingly like St. Augustine's condemnation of sex. They too recognized the moral excuse of necessity. Alcohol claimed to serve several needs, as a dietary staple, a sanitary beverage, an all-purpose nostrum against pain and winter's dank cold. As with sex, necessity did not grant unconditional license to indulge. One could use alcohol only as necessary, and never to intoxicate. In exploring the realm that lay between alcohol's necessary use and its inebriating abuse, St. Thomas Aquinas and later moralists defined temperance, or drinking in moderation, as a moral safe harbor. These three principles, the sinfulness of drunkenness, the moral excuse of necessity, and the safe harbor of moderation, largely define the terms of temperance debates raging in England and America in the 17th through 20th centuries. As set out in chapters 2 and 3, these principles helped shape the making and unmaking of England's brief 18th-century gin ban and the rise and fall of American national prohibition. The temperance wars finally subsided as combatants came to terms around a moral accommodation of alcohol. The regime that rose in Prohibition's place embraced a new view of the social necessity of alcohol, a concept that happily required a web of rules, legal and social, ensuring that social drinking always fell shy of drunkenness. This is the alcohol regime we inherit today, one that tolerates moderate drinking as a social lubricant, a facilitator of fellowship and good cheer. In this moral regime, drink makers broadcast their product's power to spark conversation, but never their power to intoxicate. Alcohol monogamy captures the essentially exclusive nature of this moral accommodation of moderate alcohol use. That most people do not call alcohol a drug suggests we box it separately in our minds from other intoxicants. Our elaborate moral rationalization of drinking has sustained our bond with alcohol even as it has shut out rival intoxicants, for the terms of this moral arrangement have proved hard for other drugs to meet. The difficulty emerged when alcohol's first real recreational rival reached American shores in the late 19th century. Opium dens, newly arrived from China, did not fit the moral framework that had sustained alcohol use. Smoked opium served no apparent need. Doctors thought it useless as medicine, and permitted no sub-intoxicating use. Unlike alcohol, opium did not enliven but narcotized conversation. Worse, it acted, or was thought to act, as a sexual stimulant, driving respectable young women to ruin. The result, detailed in Chapter 4, was that opium dens and opium smoking met ready legislative condemnation. So did other recreational drugs as they came on the scene. Legislators distinguished necessary, and hence legitimate, medical use from recreational abuse simply by criminalizing sales not made by prescription. This legislative stratagem spurred a social revolution, as lawmakers across the land passed law after endless law targeting recreational drug abuse. These early laws against opium dens and, somewhat later, cocaine and cannabis rarely had roots in racial strife. Overwhelmingly, they sprang from the traditional moral censure of intoxication for intoxication's sake. Above all, these laws responded to the moral threat posed by euphoric, mind-disabling drugs to respectable white women and youth. Chapters 5, 6, and 7, which address opium dens, cocaine, and cannabis, advance two missions. They aim first to show how fully the evidence refutes traditional claims that early anti-drug laws took rise from racial hatred. Even the most familiar claim of all, that in banning opium dens, white lawmakers acted in horror of racial mixing in the dens, proves false, at least in the early years of our drug war. These chapters document, instead, how lawmakers focused on women and youth of their own ilk. Most of our early laws against opium, cocaine, and cannabis therefore targeted white users and those who sold to them. By the time our journey arrives at the present, in Chapter 8, the racial dynamic of the drug war had grown vastly different and distressingly familiar. Even as economic realities consigned the drug trade to poorer, often non-white sellers, the law's seemingly inability to suppress the trade drove lawmakers toward ever harsher penalties. As prisons swelled with mostly non-white dealers, the entire apparatus of anti-drug law enforcement suffered attack as a tool of racial oppression, and as these attacks sharpened and spread, they helped tip the balance of public opinion toward legalizing recreational marijuana. So we arrive in the end at this historical irony. Though racial biases did not drive our drug laws' early rise, racial biases may speed those laws' demise. Introduction. Monogamy's Paradox. One night in 1891 or 1892, two unlikely figures strode down a gray and gritty alley in San Francisco's Chinatown. White men often found their way to Chinatown, but rarely at this hour, and when they did, their business was rarely good. Yet here was a minister, cane in hand. The Reverend Frederick J. Masters was on a mission, and had brought a man with a camera to record it. Down an alley of execrable squalor, with sickly fumes rising from every cellar, the men found a door that opened to a stair that dropped to a cramped and lightless passage that ended at last at another door. Masters rapped with his cane. The door opened slightly, showing a sliver of a man, a face, and a hand. The face was Chinese, the hand raised in a gesture of procul este profani, the take your trouble elsewhere of an earlier age. Addressing the man in Chinese, Masters overcame his feigned innocence and won entry to the world within. Nose, eyes, and ears soon tell us, he recalled, we are in the presence of the dusky tyrant. Opium. That such a place existed in 1892 may seem odd. 17 years before, in 1875, San Francisco wrote the nation's first ban on opium dens. The Board of Supervisors made it a crime, punished by up to 6 months in jail, to keep such a den or visit one to smoke opium. But that ordinance, driven in part by the supervisors' distress that young, white men and women of respectable parentage had begun to indulge in what most thought a Chinese vice, seemingly had little impact on dens kept by and for the Chinese. San Francisco police largely left such dens unmolested, as long as whites dared not enter. As an 1885 map of Chinatown shown in Figure I.1 suggests, figures can be found in the print and e-book formats of this book, the district remained pocked with dens, colored yellow in the map, long after the ban took hold. Masters did not go to the little establishment off Jackson Street to smoke opium. Instead, he went to investigate opium smoking among the Chinese and seek some remedy. As superintendent of the city's Methodist Chinese mission and a one-time missionary to China, he perhaps harbored two biases on his descent into the den. Unlike so many others of his day, he may have borne no hatred toward the Chinese, often victims of open and vicious racism, but as a Methodist...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?